Peter Chang, and we're at step 9 of our SCX-60 CF build. And here we're going to go ahead and assemble the motor plate. And what I'm going to do is just apply some thread lock to the motor plate itself. Usually when you apply thread lock, you could apply it to the screw, but in this case, if I apply it to the screw, then all the thread lock actually goes through the entire transmission case. And I want to keep the transmission case running as smoothly as possible. That's why I'm applying the thread lock to 3 points here to the motor plate. And once again, I need to be careful when I'm threading in the screws as well, because I don't want to get any thread lock inside the transmission. So I just want to apply thread lock to the connecting screws. So I'm just going to go ahead and hold this tight here. And the reason why I apply thread lock is that I want to keep the transmission in place. I don't want it to break apart, or it just gives it a little bit more reinforcement. But once again, just apply thread lock to the motor plate itself. Don't apply thread lock to the screws going through the transmission case, because this way you avoid getting thread lock inside the transmission. So it is a little bit messy anytime I use thread lock, and just because I'm more of a clumsy builder. So if you're a little bit more agile, or actually a lot more agile than me, you could actually have a much easier way of dealing with this. Because I'm kind of a messy builder, I'm going to keep some alcohol swabs just handy. And the reason why I like alcohol swabs is that it really cuts through the thread lock, and also the alcohol swab evaporates right away, so there's no liquid on the motor plate. So a little bit more planning and more prep work when you're building this out, but it is worthwhile. So, and I need to work a little bit quicker because I have thread lock to try to thread through on the other screw. So I'm just going to get this cap head screw in, and this is the same cap head screw that's on the SC10 transmission. And if you're using a donor car, for example, you would use the same screw there. Once again, just a little too much thread lock in there, so I'm just going to go ahead and just wipe it off. And just kind of clean it up a little bit before I thread in the third and final screw here. And once again, just take your time, be patient. Patience always wins out when you're building these things. You might get so impatient that you just want to start racing, but just take your time, enjoy the build. It's actually what it's all about, is enjoying the build, having a good time. So just take it easy, take it nice and slow. Also, when you're screwing in these screws through the transmission gear, make sure you're screwing them in perpendicular to the motor plate, so this way you don't have screws at varying angles going into the motor plate. So take your time, it should go through. And right now I'm just having a little trouble getting that last screw in there, and looks like it should go in there. I'm just going to go ahead and just tighten in the other screws here, and just trying to get this one tightened up here. In the instruction manual, it tells you to actually thread in a screw on one of the corners. This way your transmission gear actually stays in place, and so when you thread in the motor plate, everything stays in place. So once again, I'm just going to do a little cleaning. I got thread lock just everywhere now at this point, which is not a great situation to be in. So just going to just clean it up and making sure that the transmission still runs. Making sure that I didn't get any thread lock inside the transmission, which would be devastating. So once you got that complete, this is what the motor plate and the transmission should look like. So I'm just go ahead and just inspecting it one last time to make sure I don't have any extraneous thread lock anywhere. And one thing is, thread lock is actually easy to remove when it's still wet, but once it's dry, you're pretty much stuck with the thread lock wherever it's dried at. So I'm just taking the once over glance here, making sure that everything's okay and it's looking good, and just testing the transmission there once again. And if everything's looking good, then we could start assembling the Spur Gear assembly. So checking out this slipper pad. This is actually the vented V2 slipper hub, and what's interesting about these venting holes is that I'm not sure if it actually really gives it any more performance per se, but it does look fairly intimidating and very cool. So that's why I went with those. The V2 slipper spring and washer. The spring is actually really good. You don't have to adjust that much. Everything seems to go just correctly. And of course the slipper pads. Once again, the V2 ones work great too. And of course I'm going to need some lock nuts to lock everything down and lock everything in. The SCX-60 CF does come with a Spur Gear, and the Spur Gear is actually smaller than the stock Spur Gear. I'm just going to show you the stock one, the size and the scale here. So as you can see, if I move this more in the frame here, the stock one is actually a little bigger. And you're probably thinking like, well, why don't I just use my stock one? Well, it's if you put your stock one on, it's actually going to touch the outdrive. So you need to stick with the one that they gave you. So once this is set, I'm going to go ahead and start assembling my bills. So I'm going to go ahead and open up the vented slipper hub, and just making sure that everything's in the right place before I do so. So let's go ahead and grab the vented slipper hub. And just so you know, you don't have to use the vented slipper hub. It actually costs twice as much as the regular slipper hub. And the performance factor is questionable, because it's you don't know whether the additional venting might help things out or not. But I'm going to go ahead and use the vented ones just mainly for an intimidation factor at the track. It is more intimidating whenever someone that you're racing has better gear or better RC technology than you have. It doesn't really, sometimes the hopped up parts don't really add to your speed at the track, but it adds to the intimidation factor. And depending on which race you're at, intimidating your fellow RC racers is could be worthwhile. So I'm going to go ahead and put on the slipper pads, and just making sure that it fits on my Spur Gear. And when you put the slipper pads on there, it is a little tricky because the slipper pad is warped, and you want it to actually line up flat and as flush as possible. And I actually find it kind of easier with the transmission and the motor plate detached. I actually have more trouble putting on the slipper hub and slipper pad when it's actually on the actual car itself. So I actually find that maneuvering this way is a little easier for me. So I'm going to go ahead and just making sure that it aligns flush and everything is pushed in. There we go. So I'm just doing a check to make sure that everything is locking in correctly. And then I'm going to apply the slipper pad to the top of the Spur Gear, making sure that this piece stays in place, and then I'm going to put the slipper hub over it. And once again, the slipper hub is actually keyed so that it could only go in a certain way. So once this is set, I'm just going to check to make sure that the slipper hub, slipper pads don't fall out, so that they're actually lining up in place and everything is looking good. And that is great. So I'm going to go ahead and then put on my spring, and then the washer that holds the spring in place. So once again, there's a version 1 and version 2 of this spring, and I would suggest you to get the version 2 of the spring, just because it's an updated part, not necessarily a hopped up part or an upgraded part, but all the bugs have kind of been worked out between the two versions. Even though this part works better, I'm going to go ahead and compress this spring a little bit so that it's easier fitting. And I don't have to really compress too hard, just enough so that it goes down at a perpendicular angle to the slipper hub and doesn't fall out of place. So I'm going to grab my washer, put it on top of that, and then just push down a little bit, and then I'm going to grab a lock nut and put the lock nut right over it. So apologize for this being out of focus. It's just that it's actually focused for the more of a macro view here. So basically it's just a 5-40 lock nut that I'm going to be using. I'm just going to go open this up and just grab one of these. And pretty much just put it right on top. Make sure that it is firmly set. Then the next trick is going to be just threading the lock nut through. And at this point, because it's not actually the transmission's not actually installed on the body of the chassis, I'm just going to go ahead and just thread it just once or twice on here, so that I can actually see the first threads just go through. Or if you're wanting like an exact number, I would say 0.05 millimeters to spacing between the thread screw there. So I'm just kind of like tormenting myself over how much to thread this and how much to leave it out. So I'm just going to go for the 0.05 millimeters here. Or if you don't have a ruler, just when you see the first part of the threading going through the screw, that would be about 0.05 millimeters of spacing. So once I'm sure that this is set, then I should be okay. At this point, I don't have the nut drivers yet, so I'm just using the stock plastic nut driver from my RTR. And it is a little bit torturous because it feels like it's stripping or it's not quite catching correctly. So I would highly suggest getting a nut driver of the right size if you could. And I'm just going to check still to make sure that everything is tight on the slipper pad and slipper hub, that then the spur gear is actually working good. So I'm just going to turn it to make sure that it's actually going and there's some play, and then it's not too tight, and everything is still loose enough that it could spin. So just double checking to make sure that that is okay, and it looks okay. Just once again, just apologize for this part of the filming being out of focus. I was just so into trying to get that to work out okay. So I'm just going to show you just once again, I'm just out of focus here, but this is actually how much of the threading actually went through. So as you can see, it's not really much. It's just 1 or 2 turns into that bolt there. And pretty much look at the vented slipper hub. It does look fairly intimidating, and everything is checked to make sure that everything is spinning okay. Once this is set, the next step would be to attach the transmission with the slipper hub and pad and spur gear and motor plate to the chassis. So stay tuned for step 10. Thanks for watching this video.